By the latter half of 1943, the Pacific War had entered a decisive and irreversible phase. The spectacular Japanese expansion that had followed the attack on Pearl Harbor had reached its limits, and the strategic initiative was steadily passing to the United States. What had once appeared to be a dynamic and unstoppable empire now faced the harsh realities of attrition, overextension, and an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed its own. American shipyards, factories, and training facilities were operating at full capacity, transforming raw economic strength into fleets, aircraft, and trained personnel at a scale Japan could neither match nor counter. The war was no longer about survival for the United States, it was about how, where, and at what cost Japan would be defeated. This shift was rooted in the pivotal naval engagements of 1942. The battles of the Coral Sea and Midway did more than halt Japanese expansion, they fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Pacific. At Midway, Japan lost for fleet carriers and, more importantly, many of its most experienced naval aviators. These losses could not be replaced quickly, if at all. The United States, by contrast, preserved its remaining carriers and began to expand its fleet at an accelerating pace. By 1943, American naval planners could assume that reinforcements would arrive in strength, while Japanese commanders were increasingly forced to conserve their remaining assets for a decisive battle that they hoped would restore the balance. That decisive battle, however, remained elusive. On land, American strategy developed along two primary axes. In the Southwest Pacific, General Douglas MacArthur led a steady advance northward from Australia through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. His approach emphasized the isolation and neutralization of Japanese positions rather than their outright destruction whenever possible. In the Central Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz prepared for a fundamentally different campaign, one that would leap across vast ocean distances and confront heavily fortified island positions head-on. This dual advance reflected both strategic necessity and political compromise. MacArthur argued that his route offered the most direct path to the Philippines and ultimately Japan, while Nimitz and naval leadership believed that Japan's extensive island defenses demanded a direct challenge in the Central Pacific. Faced with mounting American pressure, Japanese leaders abandoned hopes of further expansion and instead focused on consolidating a defensive perimeter they referred to as the National Defense Zone. This zone stretched across the Central Pacific and relied on chains of fortified islands such as the Marshalls, Carolines, and Gilberts. These islands were conceived as unsinkable aircraft carriers, designed to provide overlapping air coverage and serve as forward barriers against any American advance. Japanese planners understood that these outposts might eventually fall, but they believed that by inflicting heavy casualties during amphibious assaults, they could weaken American resolve and create conditions favorable for a negotiated settlement. American commanders viewed this defensive system with a more pragmatic eye. Admirals such as Nimitz and Ernest King recognized that the same features which made these islands valuable to Japan, airfields, anchorages, and lagoon access, also made them ideal stepping stones for an American advance toward the Japanese home islands. The central strategic debate therefore revolved around selection. Some islands could be bypassed and isolated, left to wither without supplies or reinforcement, while others would have to be seized despite the risks. This approach, later known as island hopping, promised to conserve resources and maintain momentum, but it also raised serious concerns. Bypassed Japanese garrisons might threaten American supply lines, and every amphibious assault carried the risk of catastrophic losses. These strategic questions were debated at the highest levels of Allied leadership. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, Allied leaders formally approved a Central Pacific offensive to complement MacArthur's campaign in the Southwest. Command of this effort was assigned to Admiral Raymond Spruance, whose calm, analytical approach had been proven during the Battle of Midway. The decision committed the United States to a form of warfare that was widely regarded as one of the most complex and dangerous military operations imaginable. Amphibious assaults against prepared defenses required precise coordination between naval gunfire, air support, and ground forces, all under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Planning for these operations was complicated further by issues of command and personality. Admiral Kelly Turner was placed in charge of amphibious forces, while Marine General Holland "Howling Mad" Smith commanded the landing troops. Both were aggressive and capable officers, but both were also known for their volatile tempers and mutual distrust. Their rivalry threatened to undermine coordination at precisely the moment when unity of command was essential. After considerable friction, a compromise was reached. Turner would command amphibious operations until landing forces were firmly ashore, after which Smith would assume control of ground combat. Though imperfect, this arrangement would remain in place for the remainder of the war. Initially, American planners favored striking directly at the Marshall Islands, a key component of Japan's defensive perimeter. However, the powerful Japanese base at Truk posed a significant threat to any such operation. Rather than risk exposing invasion forces to attack from this stronghold, planners opted for a more limited objective, the Gilbert Islands. Though smaller and more remote, the Gilberts were firmly embedded within Japan's defensive system and had been occupied since late 1941. Their capture would serve as a critical test of American amphibious doctrine under real combat conditions. Operation Galvanic, scheduled for November 1943, targeted the atolls of Markin, Abemama, and Tarawa. Abemama was lightly defended and of limited strategic value, while Markin was held by several hundred Japanese troops guarding a seaplane base. Tarawa, however, represented an entirely different challenge. Within the Tarawa Atoll, the tiny island of Betio contained a vital airfield and was defended by nearly 5,000 Japanese troops, many of them elite naval infantry. Barely 3.5 kilometers long and only a few hundred meters wide, the island's geography prevented defense in depth but allowed defenders to bring fire to bear on almost any point. After a U.S. raid on nearby Markin in 1942, Betio's commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, embarked on an ambitious program of fortification. Hundreds of bunkers, reinforced concrete emplacements, shore guns, and offshore obstacles transformed the island into a fortress. Confident in his preparations, Shibazaki famously boasted that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. American intelligence identified many of these defenses through aerial and submarine reconnaissance, and former British residents provided valuable geographic information. Yet critical gaps remained. No low-level reconnaissance flights were conducted, many smaller positions went undetected, and the United States lacked specialized underwater demolition teams to survey reefs and obstacles. These oversights would soon have devastating consequences. Despite these shortcomings, American planners believed overwhelming naval and air power would compensate. The 5th Amphibious Corps, built around the 2nd Marine Division and supported by the Army's 27th Infantry Division, was tasked with capturing Tarawa and Markin on November 20, 1943. As dawn broke on the day of the invasion, American battleships opened fire on Betio with a massive bombardment. To the Marines waiting offshore, the destruction appeared total, and confidence ran high. Beneath layers of sand and concrete, however, Japanese defenders endured the storm and prepared to meet the assault that would define one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War. The naval bombardment that preceded the landings on Tarawa appeared overwhelming to those who watched it from the decks of American ships, but its true effectiveness was far more limited than expected. As the guns fell silent and the invasion timetable slipped, the carefully constructed American plan began to unravel. Communications problems aboard several ships disrupted coordination between naval gunfire and air support, while delays in assembling assault waves at sea cost precious time. These delays proved critical, granting the Japanese defenders the opportunity to emerge from their shelters, man their weapons, and redeploy forces to meet the impending assault. When the first amphibious tractors finally began their run toward Betio's northern beaches, the element of surprise was already fading. The initial assault was carried forward by tracked amphibious vehicles, known as LVTs, which were intended to carry Marines directly from ship to shore. A scout sniper platoon succeeded in landing on a long pier extending into the lagoon, briefly clearing it of Japanese machine guns and offering a small but important foothold. Elsewhere, the tracked vehicles crossed the offshore reef and entered the lagoon, an unexpected maneuver that initially surprised the defenders. Yet once inside the lagoon, the LVTs were exposed. Their thin armor offered little protection, and as they approached the beaches, Japanese machine guns, mortars, and artillery opened fire. Although the defenders' accuracy was initially inconsistent, the psychological effect on the Marines was profound. Many had expected shattered resistance after the bombardment. Instead, they encountered determined and organized opposition. When Marines disembarked onto the beaches, instinct and training drove them toward the seawall for cover. This reaction, entirely logical under intense fire, proved deadly. The Japanese had anticipated this behavior and carefully pre-sighted mortars and machine guns to saturate these areas. Mortar rounds crashed down with devastating accuracy, forcing Marines to abandon the wall and push inland across exposed ground swept by automatic weapons and snipers. Casualties mounted rapidly. Offshore, additional complications emerged as heavy fire from a fortified area later known as the Pocket, as well as from a partially submerged shipwreck converted into a firing position, drove landing vehicles off course and disrupted unit cohesion. Although American ships and aircraft eventually neutralized these threats, Japanese troops repeatedly swam out under fire to reoccupy the wreck, demonstrating remarkable determination. As the battle intensified, communication failures compounded the chaos. Radios were soaked by seawater or destroyed by enemy fire, officers were killed or wounded at alarming rates, and commanders aboard ships struggled to form a coherent picture of events unfolding on the beaches. Orders were delayed or never received, and subordinate units were often left to fight independently with little guidance. Despite these challenges, the first assault wave suffered losses that, while severe, were not yet catastrophic by the grim standards of amphibious warfare. The true disaster came with the arrival of the later waves. As some planners had feared, the landing coincided with an exceptionally low tide. While the tracked amphibious vehicles were able to cross the reef, most conventional landing craft were not. They grounded hundreds of meters from shore, forcing Marines to climb out and wade through waist and chest-deep water under direct fire. The lagoon became a killing zone. Men struggled forward, weighed down by equipment, while machine gun bullets and mortar fragments tore through the water around them. Amphibious vehicles burned fiercely, bodies floated in the shallows, and the water took on a grim, blood-tinged hue. Survivors later recalled that reaching the shore felt less like an organized assault and more like an act of individual endurance and chance. Casualties soared as wave after wave was cut down in the open. Fragmentary and alarming reports reached higher headquarters, including messages that losses had reached as high as 70% in some units. By late morning, American forces clung to a series of narrow and precarious footholds near the pier and along scattered sections of beach. Progress inland was minimal, and the beachhead remained dangerously shallow. The arrival of a small number of Sherman tanks late in the day provided a measure of relief, allowing Marines to suppress a few Japanese strongpoints and push forward incrementally. Even so, as darkness fell, thousands of exhausted Marines remained crowded within only a few hundred meters of the shoreline, exposed to fire and vulnerable to counterattack. The situation on the night of the first day was perilous. With enemy positions often only yards away, American naval gunfire and air support could not be used effectively without risking friendly casualties. A coordinated Japanese night counterattack might have driven the Marines back into the sea. Yet once again, chance played a decisive role. During the afternoon, a naval shell killed Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki before he could organize such an attack. Deprived of centralized leadership, Japanese resistance became fragmented, and no major counteroffensive materialized that night. This moment, largely unseen by those fighting on the beaches, likely saved the American foothold on Betio. The second day of fighting brought no immediate relief. Reinforcements continued to arrive under fire, and many Marines were still forced to wade ashore across the reef. Losses remained heavy. Gradually, however, American forces began to gain a clearer understanding of Japanese defensive positions. Tanks, demolitions, flamethrowers, and small unit assaults were brought to bear with increasing coordination. Marines learned through bitter experience how to neutralize bunkers, often advancing under covering fire to place explosives directly against firing ports or using flamethrowers to force defenders out. Progress was slow, costly, and exhausting, but it was progress nonetheless. By cutting the island in two and securing a safer landing area at one end, the Marines began to build momentum. Colonel David Shoup, commanding amid the chaos and often under direct fire, exemplified the resilience of the assault force. Despite severe wounds and mounting casualties, he maintained command and coordination under conditions that would have broken many leaders. His communications to higher headquarters acknowledged the grim reality of losses while affirming that American forces were gradually gaining the upper hand. Leadership at this level, often exercised in moments of extreme danger, proved decisive in sustaining the assault. By the third day, Japanese resistance was nearing collapse. A final banzai attack was launched in a desperate attempt to break the American line but was destroyed with heavy losses. Remaining defenders were systematically eliminated in brutal close-quarters fighting. In the heavily fortified area known as the Pocket, Marines employed bulldozers, explosives, and incendiaries to destroy entrenched positions, often at point-blank range. When organized resistance finally ended, the scale of the carnage became clear. More than 1,000 Americans were killed or missing, and over 2,000 were wounded in just 3 days of fighting. These losses nearly equaled those suffered during the entire 6-month campaign on Guadalcanal. Of the Japanese garrison, nearly all were killed, only a handful survived, many of them non-Japanese laborers. The shock of Tarawa reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Graphic photographs of dead Marines, published in American newspapers for the first time in the war, confronted the public with the brutal realities of the Pacific conflict. The battle ignited controversy and criticism, with some observers questioning whether such losses were justified for a tiny, remote island. Senior commanders debated the operation's value, and General MacArthur publicly criticized it as an unnecessary sacrifice. Yet within the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, Tarawa was also understood as a harsh but invaluable lesson. Even as the fighting at Tarawa concluded, American forces were engaged elsewhere in the Gilberts. On Markin, the Army's 27th Infantry Division landed in overwhelming strength against a much smaller Japanese garrison. Employing slower, more methodical tactics, the Army minimized casualties but drew criticism from Marine commanders, particularly Holland Smith, who argued that excessive caution prolonged the battle and exposed naval forces to unnecessary risk. This tension between Marine and Army approaches to amphibious warfare would persist throughout the Central Pacific Campaign. The debate was intensified when a Japanese submarine torpedoed and sank the escort carrier Leescombe Bay near Markin, killing hundreds of sailors and underscoring the dangers of prolonged operations near enemy waters. Despite controversy, Tarawa forced a comprehensive reassessment of American amphibious doctrine. Commanders identified numerous failures: inadequate attention to tides, insufficient reconnaissance of underwater obstacles, poor waterproofing of communications equipment, overloaded assault troops, and flaws in naval and air bombardment. Battleships had lifted fire too early, allowing defenders to recover, and aircraft attacks had often been poorly coordinated and ineffective against hardened bunkers. Yet Tarawa also revealed successes that would shape future operations. The tracked amphibious vehicles, though vulnerable, proved indispensable in crossing reefs and delivering troops directly onto contested beaches. These lessons were absorbed with remarkable speed. Within weeks, American planners were revising doctrine, modifying equipment, and reorganizing command structures in preparation for the next phase of the Central Pacific Offensive. The cost of Tarawa was appalling, but its impact on the conduct of the war would be profound. The United States had learned, at terrible expense, what it would take to break through Japan's island defenses. Ahead lay the Marshall Islands and beyond them the long and bloody road toward Japan itself. The lessons drawn from Tarawa were implemented with urgency as American planners turned their attention toward the Marshall Islands, the next link in Japan's defensive chain. Unlike the Gilberts, the Marshalls lay deeper within the Japanese perimeter and were believed to be far more strongly defended. Yet Tarawa had clarified both the strengths and weaknesses of Japanese island defenses, allowing the United States to adapt its methods with ruthless efficiency. The emphasis shifted toward improved intelligence, more accurate bombardment, better coordination between air, sea, and ground forces, and the expanded use of specialized amphibious equipment. Tarawa, costly as it was, had served as the crucible in which modern American amphibious warfare was forged. In January 1944, American forces struck the Marshalls with a confidence born of preparation and numerical superiority. This time, rather than assaulting every fortified position, planners applied island-hopping doctrine with greater discipline. Heavily defended Japanese strongholds were bypassed, isolated, and rendered irrelevant by air and naval power, while selected objectives were seized to support the advance. The assaults on Kwajalein and Eniwetok demonstrated just how dramatically American effectiveness had improved. Bombardments were longer, more precise, and coordinated closely with ground movements. Underwater demolition teams scouted reefs in advance, reducing surprises at the waterline. Casualties, though still significant, were far lower than those suffered at Tarawa. The contrast was striking and confirmed that the brutal lessons of November 1943 had not been wasted. As the Central Pacific Drive gained momentum, Japanese leaders found themselves trapped by strategic assumptions that no longer reflected reality. Their entire defensive concept rested on the belief that American forces could be broken through attrition at the shoreline. Yet the United States had proven willing to absorb losses, adapt, and return with greater strength. Moreover, Japan's industrial limitations meant that every lost aircraft, ship, and trained soldier was irreplaceable. The defensive perimeter was shrinking, not expanding, and with each American advance, the home islands came closer into range of sustained attack. The capture of the Marshalls opened the door to the Marianas, a group of islands whose strategic significance far exceeded their size. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam offered airfields from which the new B-29 superfortress could strike the Japanese mainland directly. Japanese leaders understood this and committed substantial forces to their defense, viewing the Marianas as a final line beyond which defeat would become inevitable. When American forces landed in June 1944, the fighting was ferocious. Yet despite determined resistance, the outcome was never truly in doubt. American firepower, logistics, and air superiority overwhelmed Japanese defenses, while the Imperial Navy's attempt to intervene culminated in the catastrophic Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japan's remaining carrier air arm was effectively destroyed. The fall of the Marianas triggered a political crisis in Tokyo. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was forced to resign, and Japan's leadership confronted the grim reality that the war could no longer be won. Yet surrender remained unthinkable. Military doctrine, cultural beliefs, and fear of occupation drove Japanese leaders to seek a final, decisive confrontation that might yet alter the terms of defeat. This mindset led directly to the development of increasingly desperate measures, including the widespread use of suicide attacks and the mobilization of civilian populations for homeland defense. Meanwhile, American strategy continued to advance along converging paths. In the Philippines, MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return, landing on Leyte in October 1944. The ensuing battles, both on land and at sea, shattered what remained of Japan's naval power. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history, effectively ended the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. Kamikaze attacks, introduced during this campaign, inflicted painful losses but could not reverse the strategic tide. They were a symptom of desperation rather than a viable strategy. As American forces closed in on Japan itself, the nature of the fighting grew increasingly brutal. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa revealed what a direct assault on the home islands might entail. Japanese defenders, fighting from elaborate underground positions, resisted with fanatical determination. Casualties soared on both sides, and civilian losses were staggering, particularly on Okinawa, where the population was caught between two uncompromising military forces. These battles reinforced American fears that an invasion of Japan would result in catastrophic losses, potentially dwarfing even the bloodshed of Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa combined. At the same time, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan intensified. From bases in the Marianas, B-29 bombers conducted devastating raids on Japanese cities, culminating in the firebombing of Tokyo and other urban centers. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained, was systematically dismantled. Yet even under this relentless assault, Japan showed no sign of surrender. Military leaders clung to the hope that inflicting sufficient casualties might compel the United States to negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. The final decision to employ atomic weapons must be understood within this context. American leaders, faced with projections of enormous casualties from a conventional invasion, sought a means to end the war decisively. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, shattered any remaining illusions within the Japanese government. The emperor's unprecedented decision to intervene and accept surrender reflected the recognition that continued resistance would mean national annihilation. Looking back, the path from Tarawa to Tokyo reveals a war shaped as much by learning and adaptation as by raw power. Tarawa stands as a turning point not because of its scale, but because of what it taught. It stripped away illusions about the ease of amphibious warfare and exposed the true cost of confronting Japan's island defenses. The United States paid dearly for those lessons, but it learned them quickly and applied them relentlessly. Each subsequent operation was conducted with greater precision, coordination, and effectiveness, narrowing the gap between sacrifice and strategic gain. For Japan, Tarawa and the battles that followed marked the beginning of an irreversible decline. The defensive strategy built on attrition and sacrifice failed to account for an opponent capable of replacing losses, improving methods, and sustaining a long war. Courage and determination, no matter how extraordinary, could not compensate for strategic isolation and industrial inferiority. By the time American forces reached the doorstep of Japan, the outcome was no longer in doubt, only the manner in which the war would end. In the broader sweep of history, the Pacific War illustrates the decisive role of industrial power, logistics, and adaptability in modern conflict. It was not simply a contest of bravery or will, but a struggle between systems, one flexible and expansive, the other rigid and increasingly desperate. Tarawa, in all its horror, represents the moment when that reality became unmistakably clear. From its beaches, stained with blood and scarred by fire, the road to Japan was opened, and with it the final chapter of the Second World War in the Pacific.